I just want to start with a word of prayer. Most kind and gracious Heavenly Father, thank you for this wonderful opportunity to come together and celebrate 100 years of your service to mankind in bringing health, physical, mental, and spiritual. I ask the words that are spoken here today be not mine, but your words. And let our hearts be prepared to hear and to act. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Now let me just quickly put to rest a rumor that has been going around that I have bad health. It is not true at all. But, a couple of years ago, it was true. And, I was a person who would conscientiously have my physical exams done every year, get my PSAs checked. I did all the things you're supposed to do. Everything was good. But I guess I'm lucky that I'm a neurosurgeon because we do long operations. And I used to do 10, 12, 14-hour operation, never worry about breaking for the bathroom. And I began to notice all of a sudden I was interested in what time it was. And I need to go to the bathroom. I said, this represents a change. So I went to see the chief of urology at Hopkins, Pat Walsh, probably the most famous urologist in the world. And he said, yeah, you probably got a little prostatitis. So let's try you on some antibiotics. I tried it, it didn't help. He said, nah, maybe you got a little focal hypertrophy. Let's try a little Flomax. Didn't work. He said, well, now, what was your PSA again? He said, well, even though it was normal, maybe we better repeat it. So we repeated it. This time it was slightly elevated. So he said, well, I think you need to have a biopsy done. Now, if anybody has ever told you that a prostate biopsy doesn't hurt, it doesn't hurt them. Okay, that's the part they didn't tell you. After about the 6th or 7th biopsy, you're ready to say, if I have cancer, that's fine. But anyway, afterwards he said, you're a young man, the chances of you having cancer are low, don't worry about it, less than 18%. I said, nevertheless, I want to hear as soon as you know something. The next day I get a call while I'm in the operating room. The nurse holds the phone up to my ear and I get the news. Not only do I have cancer, but I have a very high-grade malignant form. And then I had an MRI done to see if there was spread. And I remember coming out of the machine and I figured the radiologist would be standing there to tell me that everything looked great. But there was no radiologist there. And as I was leaving, the technician handed me an envelope with my films in it and said, I thought you might like to have these. And I went up and hung them on the view board in my office, and my heart sank as I saw all these lesions up and down my spine. And I said, wow, it's been a good life. And then my senior PA came in while I was sitting at my desk, and she said, what did it show? I said, it's over there on the board. And she went and looked at it and came back with the longest face imaginable. And, it was a time of concern. But I used to always wonder how I would deal with death when I was facing it. And I must say, it really wasn't that frightening. I remember I kept humming the song, Welcome Home, Children, and thinking about the Lord. The only sad thing about it was I thought I would have to leave my family and my patients and other people who were dependent on me. But other than that, it wasn't frightening. But interestingly enough, the very next day on the radio, they were announcing that I had a glioblastoma, a malignant tumor of the brain. And then I had liver cancer, lung cancer, colon cancer, bone cancer, you name it, I had it. I was dying, I had died already. One lady called my office, she said, I heard Dr. Carson was dead, I want to speak to him, I mean, it was just amazing. But, the outpouring of sentiment from around the world was incredibly touching. I had more than 10 bags of cards and letters from janitors to President and Mrs. Bush, all saying they were praying for me. And I think the Lord just got tired of hearing about me because, it turned out that the lesions on the MRI represented a congenital anomaly of the bone marrow, completely benign. And I was able to have surgery done by Dr. Walsh, who invented the nerve-sparing prostatectomy. And it turns out that the cancer was within 1 millimeter of breaking through, but it wasn't broken through. We got it in time, and I'm completely cured today, and there's no recurrence, so praise God for that. But medicine has always been the only thing that was of any interest to me, as a youngster. Listening to the mission stories in church and Sabbath school, frequently featuring missionary doctors, it seemed like the most wonderful thing a person could do. And I, as a kid, used to love to go to the doctor's office. Most kids don't like that, but there was a certain appeal to me about those needles and syringes and cotton swabs and stuff. I loved it. Stethoscopes. And going to the hospital was the best thing of all. And we were a medical assistant, so we would have to wait for many hours before one of the interns or residents could see us. And I didn't mind at all because I could listen to the PA system. Dr. Jones, Dr. Jones, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Cooper, to the clinic, to the emergency room. They sounded so important. And I'd be thinking one day they'll be saying, Dr. Carson, to the operating room. But of course nowadays we have beepers, so I still don't get to hear it. But it is important to have that dream, to have, something that carries you through the rough areas, because there are a lot of rough spots that come through, and you got to have that drive and that dream. Sometimes that dream does not lead to a good place. I remember last summer, being involved with the Bajani twins, the Iranian young ladies who were joined at the head, and they had a dream of being separated. And that had driven them for years and years. When I first heard about their case, I was not enthusiastic and discouraged anything, but it became clear that they were going to go ahead with this operation in Singapore, whether I helped or not. So I decided I better go and help. And I'll tell you, meeting them was quite an experience. They were so vivacious, had incredible personalities. They had learned to speak English in only 7 months. Now, that is an amazing thing. And they were so intelligent. They both had college degrees. They both had legal degrees. Only one wanted one, but they both had legal degrees. And they had very thorough understanding of things. But the thing that really impressed me is when they said they would rather die than spend one more day joined together. And a lot of times we don't put ourselves in other people's places before we start making judgments about them and for them. And that was probably one of the most important things I learned about that. We were about 90% through that operation before things went awry, and of course they didn't survive. But we learned a lot of things from that. But dreams don't always lead to a good place if they're not rooted in the right kinds of things. We have to make sure our dreams are appropriate. Now, there were a lot of bumps along the way before I realized my dream. First of all, my parents got divorced when I was young, and that was a devastating blow. And some of you have probably been through that, and you know what I'm talking about. My mother, as you heard, was one of 24 children and got married at age 13, and she and my father moved from rural Tennessee to Detroit, where he worked as a factory worker, and she discovered he was a bigamist, had another family. I remember telling that story at a graduation at the University of Utah, and nobody thought it was that strange. But she thought it was very strange indeed. Now, of course, they don't do that in Utah anymore, okay? That's a thing of the past, okay? Some of the most upstanding people I've ever met are from Utah. But, we moved from Detroit to Boston to live with her older sister and brother-in-law. Typical tenement, large multifamily dwelling, sirens, games, rats and roaches, murders. Both of my cousins we lived with were murdered. It was just a terrible environment. But, my mother was working 2, sometimes 3 jobs at a time as a domestic because she didn't want to be on welfare. She figured if she went on welfare, she would give up control of her life and control of our lives. She only had a third grade education, but she would work as hard as she needed to work. And you know, that was a great thing about her. With all the difficulty in her life, she never felt sorry for herself. The problem was she never felt sorry for us either. So, you know, there was never any excuse that we could make that was good enough. She would always say, do you have a brain? And if the answer to that was yes, then she would say, then you could have thought your way out of it. It really doesn't matter what John or Mary or Susan or anybody else thought. And you know, interestingly enough, if people will not accept your excuses, then pretty soon you stop looking for excuses and you start looking for solutions. And you know, that's the wonderful thing about the way we were created in the image of God. He gave us a brain that allows us to extract information from the past and the present to formulate a plan that we can project into the future so that we have some control over what's happening in our lives, as opposed to animals who simply have to be victims of circumstance. You know, I wrote an article about that, many of you probably saw, in the Parade magazine last December, talking about how incredible the human brain is and how it sets us above the animals. And a man wrote me a nasty letter, and he said I was a speciest. Not a racist, a speciest. Because I would dare imply that people were better than animals. Can you imagine that? Well, at any rate, you know, my mother worked hard, and she figured that eventually we would be able to move back to Detroit. And after a couple of years, we did. And there I was in the 5th grade, and I was a terrible student. I didn't think I was very smart. This was an opinion that my classmates shared also. And in fact, my middle name was Dummy. That's what everybody called me, Benjamin Dummy Carson. But I didn't think I was going to learn, so I didn't pay attention. I would be in the room shooting paper wads, telling jokes, creating distractions. I used to love to study my classmates and determine what it is that would irritate them. And because I knew that if I could get them really irritated, there would be an outburst and the teacher would kick them out of class. And I wouldn't be the only one who didn't learn anything that day. So I always was studying people around me. And I remember once this girl was sitting in front of me, and I was irritating her, and she was boiling. You could see the steam come out of her ears, and I said one more thing, and she's going to explode. So I said one more thing, but she didn't explode. She just quietly turned around, and she said, you and me on the playground at recess. So that one didn't work out too well. You know, I became a neurosurgeon, she became a professional wrestler. But you know, my mother was very concerned about the fact that I wasn't doing well. My brother wasn't doing well. She didn't know what to do, so she prayed and she asked God to give her the wisdom to know what to do to get her young sons to understand the importance of intellectual development. And God gave her the wisdom. At least in her opinion. My brother and I didn't think it was all that wise. You know, turning off the TV, what kind of wisdom is that? And making us read 2 books apiece from the Detroit Public Libraries and submitting to her written book reports, which she couldn't read, but of course we didn't know that. She would put little check marks on them and underline things, and she would say, let's discuss your book report, you know. And she would be able to discuss it on the basis of what we told her, but she couldn't read it. But, you know, the interesting thing is, we were desperately poor, but between the covers of those books, I could go anywhere, I could be anybody, I could do anything. And I began to know things soon that nobody else knew. And within the space of a year and a half, went from the bottom of the class to the top. Same kids who called me dummy were now coming to me saying, Benny, how do you work this problem? And I might say, sit at my feet, youngster, while I instruct you. It's perhaps a little obnoxious, but it sure felt good to say that to those turkeys. But, you know, the key thing there was, you know, I changed my impression of who I was. I began to use what God had given me. And, you know, I'm going to need some of my instruments because I'm a surgeon. And Dr. Paulson, do you have the most important instrument in your bag that perhaps I could use today? There it is, just what I'm looking for. Thank you. The Holy Bible. Sharper than a two-edged sword, able to split anything apart and discern where real wisdom is. Well, you know, I want you to think about something here. When we get back to the speciest argument, you know, God said, let us make man in our image, in Genesis 1:26, after our likeness. Now, what is the likeness of God? Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. Now, does that sound like man is equal to all the other creatures to you? So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And God blessed them. And God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. And later on, he brought all of these things to man and asked him to name them. And whatever man named them, that's what they were. So I don't think there's anything wrong with man claiming his heritage as someone who is made in the image of God. And why do people say things like you shouldn't place yourself above the animals? Why do people imply that we are all on the same level and that we actually are derived from other creatures? I think the answer to that is because they want to get rid of God. They don't want to have a God so they can do anything they want. You know, you think back to Darwinism. Charles Darwin, a man of the cloth, believer in God, and his 10-year-old daughter became desperately ill, and he implored God to heal his daughter, but she died, and he was bitter that God did not save his daughter, and he set out to prove that God didn't exist. And he began doing things like going to the Galapagos Islands and noticing different species. He noticed that the finches there, the birds, had very thick beaks. Everywhere else they had thin beaks. This was different than any other finch anywhere in the world. There was an evolutionary spiral going on here. He had evidence. Of course, what he didn't know is that there had been a drought in the Galapagos for 3 years before that. The only finches that were able to survive were the ones with thick beaks that could break open the seedlings and get to nutrition, which in turn were the only ones who could reproduce. And they passed that trait on. So, yes, that is evidence of natural selection. That is evidence of survival of the fittest. But that is not evidence of evolution. That is evidence of a creator who was smart enough to give his creatures the ability to adapt when there was a change in their environment so that they wouldn't be wiped out by everything that came along. And you know, people of faith have to be willing to look at the evidence that the so-called scientists put out there and find reasonable ways to refute them. You know, Charles Darwin said his theory would be proven when we were able to find fossil evidence of every progression from the slime pit to man. And it would be crystallized in a way that no one could refute. Now, he admitted that at that time they did not have the geological expertise to produce these fossil specimens, but he predicted that within 50 to 100 years, the geological expertise would exist, and his theory would be proven. It would no longer be a theory. That was 150 years ago. We still haven't found them, nor are we going to find them, because they don't exist. You know, I've had arguments with people like Don Johanson, who discovered Lucy, the so-called missing link. And yes, if you look at the skull and the bony features, it does look a little unusual, I have to confess. But as a neurosurgeon, I've had the opportunity to operate on many people with deformities and strange shaped skulls and all kinds of deformities. And when those people die, they leave skeletons. And there's no reason to believe that there weren't such people at all other points in time too. And that's exactly what I told Don. I said, now if you can produce for me a whole colony of these, we got something to talk about. But if you're only going to produce one and say that that's the missing link, well look, I can go to the morgue and I can find you a lot of the missing links. You know, you have to be willing to confront the attacks upon who we are and where do we come from. And you know, if survival of the fittest is the means through which evolution occurred, then it should still be going on. So how would you be able to explain the fact that a person walking by a river, seeing someone drowning that they don't even know, is willing to jump in that river and try to save them? That would make no sense whatsoever in the survival of the fittest philosophy. And when you bring that up to them, well, you know, you don't really understand everything. Well, what about, I say, how did the universe get here? Big Bang Theory, okay? You say, well, think about this. You believe in all the scientific theories, right? Of course. I said, what about thermodynamics and the various laws of thermodynamics? Of course. I said, what about entropy, the second law, that says things move toward a state of disorganization? Yeah, of course we believe that. I said, so you're telling me that there's all this stuff out there and there's a big bang and it comes completely into order to the point where we can predict 60 years, 70 years when a comet is coming? Now, how does that fit with entropy? Well, we don't understand everything, you know. That's what they always say, we don't understand everything. I said, well, you say that we evolve bit by bit, little things happen which make the organ system a little more adaptable and able to function. I said, what about the eyeball? The human eyeball, very complex structure, has many, many parts, all of which need the other parts in order to be functional. So, how did that happen? How did all these little parts occur because they wouldn't have any function? Well, we don't understand everything. You know, that's what they always say. Well, the fact of the matter is, I then say, you have a theory in which you place your faith, and I have a theory in which I place my faith. And I said, you can believe that if you want, but I simply don't have enough faith to believe what you believe. I'm a person of limited faith, so I have to believe in God. You know, that always gets them when you say that. But it is true. God has planted wonderful evidence for us. You look at the complexity of the human brain. There is nothing in the universe that even begins to compare with the complexity of your brain, billions and billions of neurons, hundreds of billions of interconnections. It remembers everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever heard. How many people remember your birthday? Let me just see your hand. Okay, that's pretty good. Now, what did your brain have to do for you to respond to that question? First of all, the sound waves had to leave my lips, travel through the air, enter your external auditory mediators, travel down to your tympanic membrane, set through a vibratory force, which travel across the oscillars of the middle ear to the oval and round window, set through a vibratory force in the endolymph, which mechanically distorted the microcilia, converting mechanical energy to electrical energy, which travel across the cochlear nerve to the cochlear nucleus at the pontomedullary junction, from there to the superior olivary nucleus, ascending virally up the brainstem to the loud meniscus, to the inferior colliculus and the medial geniculate nuclei, across the thalamic radiations to the posterior temporal lobes, begin the auditory processing. From there to the frontal lobes, coming down the tract of Victor's ear, return to memory from the media hippocampal structure to the mammary bodies, back to the frontal lobes to start the motor response at the bet cell level, coming down the corticospinal tract, across the internal capsule into the cerebral peduncle, descending down to the cervical medullary decussation into the spinal brain area, synapsing door, going out to the neuromuscular junction, stimulating the nerve and the muscle, so you can raise your hand. Now that of course, is the simplified version of what your brain has to do. See if you can get one of those rap singers to do that. But if you put your mind to something, can you imagine what the human brain is actually capable of? And that's what we need to understand. And we need to understand that God has given us plenty of evidence of who He is, and plenty of evidence of who we are. And He wants us to use what He has given us to bring honor and glory to His holy name. Let me just close by talking about the manifestation of God's glory and keeping ourselves in perspective. In 1997, I was asked to come to South Africa to head up a team and attempt to separate type 2 vertical craniopagus twins. Siamese twins joined at the top of the head, facing in opposite directions. There have been 13 attempts to separate twins like that previously, none of which have been successful. So I knew it was going to be a great challenge. But it was also going to be a social challenge because it was going to be done at the Medical University of South Africa at Medunsa, the only major black teaching hospital, always the stepchild throughout apartheid. And in the post-apartheid period, this was going to be their chance to stand shoulder to shoulder with Cape Town and Johannesburg and all the other great universities. Well, I wasn't ready for all that social pressure. And I just said, Lord, you got to show me something here, because greater and more capable people than me have tried this and have failed. And as I was looking at the various studies, we were able to merge all the studies into our 3D workstation, put on the goggles, and have a virtual image. And I realized that the common drainage system was a little narrower in the middle than it was on either end. The common neurosurgical literature said you should decide which twin to give the drainage system to, separate the other one over the course of 3 or 4 operations divided in time, and that they would develop enough collaterals. But I felt strongly that if we concentrated on a narrowed area, that the circulation would adjust itself appropriately, and over one long operation we could do this. When I explained that to the team, they said, well, you're the boss. We'll do whatever you want to do. Well, I remember going to that operating room 2 days before New Year's of '98, big sign over the door that said, God bless Joseph and Luca Banda. And they were having song service and prayer service. I was thrilled. I said, bring in a stereo system so we can play inspirational music. 19 hours into the operation, we were only 3/4 of the way finished. The part that remained was so complex. The blood vessels were engorged, they were entangled. It looked impossible. We went into a conference, and I suggested we could cover it over with skin, come back in several months, cut through it, and they would have developed enough collaterals that they would survive. And the doctors from South Africa said, it's a wonderful idea, and I know that would work at Johns Hopkins. But we don't have the ability to keep partially separated twins alive. They'll die. Now I really felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. I didn't have all my fancy equipment that I have at Hopkins. I had my surgical loops, my scalpel, and a prayer on my lips, and I said, Lord, it's up to you. I started cutting through those blood vessels that were so thin you could see the anesthetic bubbles flowing through, just daring you to make a nick in them. Make a long story short, when I made the final cut, over the stereo system came the Hallelujah chorus. Everybody had goosebumps, and when we finished that operation after 28 hours, one of the twins popped his eyes open and reached up for the endotracheal tube. The other one did the same thing. By the time we got to the ICU, within 2 days they were extubated. Within 3 days they were eating. Within 2 weeks they were crawling. And today they're in 3rd grade, perfectly normal. But you know, that's not the success. The success was the reaction of the people who were literally dancing in the street. They were so happy. Their level of self-esteem was through the roof. You see, really, isn't that what success is all about? Using the talent that God has given you to elevate other people in every way that we can. And it's what I mean when I say think big. Each one of those letters means something special. The T for talent, which God gave to every single person, not just the ability to sing and dance and throw a ball. Have nothing against those things, by the way. Sports and entertainment, it's fine. But we overblow it sometimes. You know, I was even in a movie last year. Some of you might have seen it, Stuck on You, with Matt Damon and Greg Kinnear. They were Siamese twins, and I was the surgeon who separated them. Well, you know, we got $500,000 for that, for our scholarship fund, by the way. And, but we need to recognize intellectual talent, and we need to honor that amongst our young people. The H is for honesty. Lead a clean and honest life. You don't put skeletons in the closet. You put them there, they always come back to haunt you. And if you always tell the truth, you don't have to try to remember what you said 3 months ago. It makes your life much easier. The I is for insight, which comes from listening to people who've already gone where you're trying to go. Learn from their triumphs, learn from their mistakes. The N is for nice. Be nice to people. Because once they get over the suspicion of why you're being nice, they'll be nice to you. And you get so much more done when you're being nice and they're being nice. Can we all take the niceness pledge? Just raise your hand right where you are. All hands up. If the person beside you doesn't have their hand up, kick them. Okay? All right. Okay. Because it's the last time you can't be nice. Okay? Now, what we have just pledged to do is be nice to everybody we encounter for 1 week. Okay? Everybody. That includes your spouse, too. Okay. Now, here's what you just agreed to do. You're not going to talk about anybody behind their back for a week. Okay? Some people are going to stroke out. I understand that. Okay. Men, we're going to bring chivalry back. You're going to open the doors for the ladies and hold their chairs. Okay? Ladies, no cursing at them when they do that. Okay. When you get on the elevator, don't act like you never saw the numbers change. Speak to people. Say hello. Say hello to maids, to janitors, people you normally walk by. They have feelings, and Jesus died for them. You're going to get in your car. There's no parking spaces. You see 3 people following you in their car because they want your space. When you get in the car, you're not going to open the glove box and pull down the mirror. Just get out of the space and let them have it. You don't have to revel in your power. You know, just for a week. But what are you doing during that week? Thinking about others first. What kind of society could we have if everybody thought of others first? Isn't it what we're supposed to be about? The K is for knowledge, which is the thing that makes you into a more valuable person. I do have a big house. I do have a lot of cars. I do have a lot of things that Robin Leach of Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous thinks are important. Are they important? Of course not. They mean nothing. And if they all disappeared tomorrow, I really don't care, because I can get them all right back almost instantly with what's up here. Or at least I could before managed care. But, you know... But you know, that's what Solomon meant when he said gold, silver, and rubies are nice, but be treasured far above those things. Knowledge, wisdom, understanding, because he knew with those you could get all the gold and silver and rubies you wanted, but more importantly, you would come to understand that those things don't amount to a hill of beans, and that the most important thing is developing your God-given talent to the point where you can become valuable to the people around you. The B is for books, which is the mechanism for obtaining that knowledge. And you know, it's never too late. My mother did eventually teach herself to read, got her GED, went on to college, and in 1994 got an honorary doctorate degree, so she's Dr. Carson now too. So it's never too late. The second I is for in-depth learning, learning for the sake of knowledge and understanding, as opposed to superficial learners who cram before a test. sometimes do okay, but 3 weeks later know nothing. We cannot afford that. And the last letter, G, is for God. We live in a society that is trying to exclude God. Lawyers came to me some years ago and they said, you can't put your Think Big banners up in public schools because the G stands for God. And the First Amendment says there can be no government-sponsored religion. Well, I reminded them that the First Amendment also says there can be no government suppression of religious expression. So we had a rather vigorous argument, and I suggested that we resolve it at the level of the Supreme Court. Now, does that seem like a bold and audacious statement? It wasn't, because I knew the very next week I was going to the Supreme Court to receive the Jefferson Award. And I figured I would ask while I was there, and I did. And Justice Sandra Day O'Connor said they were completely wet. They had no idea what the Constitution said. And you know, people who say silly stuff like that, do they understand anything about the founding of this nation? Do they understand that our Declaration of Independence talked about certain inalienable rights that our Creator, a.k.a. God, endowed us with? That the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag says we are one nation under God? That most courtrooms in the land on the wall, it says, in God we trust? Every coin in your pocket, every bill in your wallet says, in God we trust? So, if it's in our founding documents, it's in our pledge, it's in our courts, and it's on our money, but we're not supposed to talk about it, what in the world is that? In medicine, we call it schizophrenia. And doesn't that explain a lot of what goes on in our society today? And we need to stand boldly before God and before our fellow man, and we need to make it clear to everybody that it's okay to live by godly principles of loving your fellow man, of caring about your neighbor, of developing your God-given talents to the utmost so that you become valuable to the people around you, of having values and principles that govern your life. And when we do that, then and only then will we have one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you and congratulations on this momentous occasion.